This video is unlike anything you've seen. With the upcoming US presidential election, the internet is swarming with economic comparisons of the Trump and Biden administrations. The direct comparison of numbers is not sufficient though. The economy is not in a vacuum. Both presidents led the country in a very different world. To account for the global events and developments, I decided to add another dimension to the analysis, and that is a comparison with other developed economies, specifically whether USA overperformed or underperformed other economies on macroeconomic indicators during both presidencies and by how much. I can promise you that both sides will be surprised. I will compare GDP, unemployment, inflation, and debt. Keep in mind that Biden presidency is not yet over. I mean, officially, so this video cannot cover the last 2 quarters. Let's start with real GDP growth during Trump's presidency. The data is shown in quarterly frequency as a quarter-on-quarter growth rate. As you can see, the COVID lockdowns caused the annoying problem of making both the analysis and the visualization harder. The drop in GDP in the second quarter of 2020 was the largest in American history, as was the case for many other countries. So even though the recovery started already in the second half of that year, the pandemic worsened the average GDP growth of the Trump presidency. When we zoom in by excluding 2020, the growth looks like this. It was positive in all quarters and very solid, with the exception of the slowdown in late 2018. Biden's growth started very strong, but not because of any genuine prosperity, but because the economy was exiting lockdowns and recovering from the artificially suppressed state. This became more apparent when the economy sunk into recession in the first half of 2022, before returning to solid growth. Over the full sample, the average annualized real GDP growth during Trump's presidency was close to 2%, while during Biden's almost 3%. Interestingly, when we exclude the COVID years of 2020 and 2021, the numbers basically flip. Excluding those years may seem random, but as you will see shortly in comparison with other economies, it's actually very pertinent. The countries to which USA will be compared are Japan, Germany, UK, France, Canada, and Australia. They are all developed economies, and the comparison with them seems most relevant. This is how to read these graphs. The US growth rate is standardized to 0, so the graphs do not show absolute growth, but rather overperformance or underperformance of the given countries relative to USA in each quarter. So for example, in Q1 of 2017, Japan's GDP growth was 0.3% faster, while during Q4 it was 1.1% slower. In the bottom right corner, there are average annualized growth rates over the 4-year period in absolute terms. Most importantly, here you can see the difference between USA and the given country. This graph shows that Japanese growth between 2017 and 2020 was basically 0, so USA overperformed Japan in terms of GDP growth during this period by some 2% per year. During Biden's presidency, Japan registered at least a sluggish growth, so USA overperformed Japan only slightly less than during Trump's term. Germany is the other laggard in the sample, being beaten by Trump's America by more than 1% annually. Incredibly, Germany fared worse during the post-COVID period than during the first 4 years, as the only country out of those compared. Crippled by deindustrialization, it was outperformed by Biden's America by more than 2.2% per year. The British economy was hit especially badly by the lockdowns. As a result, Trump overperformed his colleagues on the other side of the ocean by almost 1.9% annually. However, the rapid fall was followed by a rapid recovery, so during the 3.5 years of Biden presidency, the UK grew slightly faster than USA. France had the same average growth rate like Germany between 2017 and 2020, and thus underperformed USA by more than 1%. During the Biden years, France grew decently, and thus USA fared better by 0.7%. The northern Canadian neighbors grew 0.6% slower during Trump and 0.5% slower during Biden. Australians had solid growth in both periods, being only slightly slower than the Americans. This graph shows all the relative scores simultaneously. As you can see, Biden had much better results than Trump in comparison with Germany. Trump had much better results against the UK and slightly better results in all other cases. The total average overperformance of USA during Trump presidency was 1.14%, while Biden's was 0.86%. Interestingly, the American overperformance did not diminish during 2020, so when Trump says,
"We did a phenomenal job with the pandemic,"
he is not actually lying. So the GDP growth slightly favors Trump. With unemployment, you see somewhat similar dynamic. Prior to COVID, the unemployment was on a downward trend the entire Trump's term. Then, it inadvertently skyrocketed due to the lockdowns, reaching a high of 13% in Q2 of 2020, before starting to decline again. Biden, through no fault of his own, started his term with still elevated unemployment. But also, through no credit of his own, the unemployment continued declining due to the loosening of the lockdowns. So the talk about 15 million new jobs is just nonsense. In the full sample, the average unemployment during Trump was 5%, while under Biden, 4.16%. When excluding the COVID years for both presidents, Trump's average was 4%, while Biden's 3.7%. The labor force participation rate was some 1% higher during Trump, so altogether, their numbers are very similar. So how did both presidents fare in comparison with the other economies? With Trump, you're going to see the very same pattern everywhere. In every single case, USA had much higher rise in unemployment during the lockdowns, and I'll explain why in a minute. Even then, USA outperformed France, Canada, and Australia on unemployment on average. Under Biden, USA outperformed the very same states, plus UK by a tiny margin. So relatively speaking, Biden had better scores with Japan, Germany, and the UK than Trump. And the reverse is true for France, Canada, and Australia. In total, Trump's America had lower average unemployment rate by some third of a percentage point, while Biden's overperformance was little over a half a percentage point. But again, COVID had outsized influence on the result. If we look at the sample excluding COVID, Trump's overperformance was almost 1.2%, while Biden's 0.8%. Now, what is the reason for such great difference during the lockdowns? In reality, it is mostly an optical illusion. The other states had in place direct wage subsidy schemes, such as the famous German Kurzarbeit, during which the government paid the majority of the workers' wages, even if they were not actually working. The stimulus checks and other measures had essentially the same role, they just weren't as successful in optically keeping the unemployment low. Think about it this way. All of the other states, with the exception of Australia, had more pronounced drops in GDP during Q2 of 2020, yet much lower hike in unemployment. USA had a quarterly drop in GDP of barely 8%, while UK had over 20%. At the same time, the US unemployment rate jumped more than 9%, while in the UK it inched upward by mere 0.1%. Yeah, right. This should convince you that it really is not much more than a statistical illusion. Given that, I would consider the numbers excluding COVID as more reflective of the reality, and therefore again more in Trump's favor. If you value such unconventional analysis, consider supporting me by subscribing and liking this video. Naturally, the economic highlight of this election is inflation. Under Trump, the inflation was around the central bank target of 2% per year. During the pandemic, prices even dipped a little, taking the average down to 1.9%. Biden's administration, on the other hand, presided over an economy where inflation was attacking double digits in the middle of 2022, leading to current average of some 5.3%. During the 4 years of Trump's mandate, prices grew in total by less than 8%. Under Biden, they are already 20% up, with 2 quarters still to go. Nevertheless, the inflation did not just fall from the sky due to Biden's incompetence. The tidal wave of inflation swept almost the entire Western world. It was a perfect storm. COVID lockdowns temporarily suppressed demand, disrupted supply, governments undertook the largest fiscal spending in history, and central banks' printing presses were working overtime, metaphorically. Then the war in Ukraine and sanctions against Russia caused price hikes on the energy markets, which spilled over to the rest of the economy. It couldn't have ended any other way. Given these circumstances, how did both gentlemen fare in comparison with the other economies? Trump's America had higher inflation than every one of the compared countries, with UK around the same level. Biden's America had also higher inflation than the others, with the exception of UK, which did really poorly in 2022. In total, USA under both presidents had higher inflation than the other economies, by over half a percentage point per year on average, with Trump being even higher. Importantly, inflation is mainly the domain of central banks. And even though I do not share this view, inflation under Trump was very close to the Fed target, while mainstream economists in the other countries were complaining about too low inflation. So under Trump, inflation wasn't an issue. Under Biden, it is. He didn't really do anything to mitigate it. The Inflation Reduction Act has nothing to do with inflation. Still, it is unlikely that under Trump it would have been any different. The only variable that the presidents have some control over is fiscal spending, and neither of them was particularly thrifty. Which leads us directly to the debt situation. If we look at the federal budget deficits in absolute numbers, it's obvious that the deficits are higher under Biden, summing up to some $7.8 trillion compared to Trump's $5.6 trillion. The COVID years played an outsized role again. Biden's deficits during the non-COVID years were around double those of Trump. Of course, the real value of these deficits is somewhat eroded by the recent inflation. The current administration may try to hide behind the debt-to-GDP ratio. Trump's debt to GDP skyrocketed in 2020 by over 20% due to both the high deficit and also the fall in GDP of the locked-down economy. Biden's debt to GDP improved slightly, partly because of the recovery as mentioned in Chapter 1, but mainly thanks to inflation. As I mentioned in the video about inflation trade-offs, the nice side effect of inflation is that it also erodes the real value of the already accumulated debt by ballooning the nominal GDP. It's a beneficial side effect, but hardly something to praise Biden for. I can't do the international comparison here because of insufficient availability of recent data, but the trends seem similar. In total, I would say Trump was better for the economy, but not by an overwhelming margin. The difference between USA and other developed economies is typically higher than difference between those presidents. Culture, institutions, and structure of the economy are typically more important factors than an individual administration. Also, the past results do not guarantee the future outcomes. Still, Harris and the Democratic Party are proponents of DEI, which is anti-meritocratic ideology. She would likely retain elements of Bidenomics with more leftist swing. Her proposed policies, such as the unrealized gains tax, are the worst thing she could possibly do to financial markets, hurting not just the rich, but also the middle class. She also represents the green ideology, which hurt the German industry so much. Trump's economic policy would likely be quite similar, with doubling down on tariffs. Even though tariffs are also a double-edged sword, I think Harris would be more detrimental to USA, both in short term through her policies and in the long term through spreading the damaging ideologies. Comment below what surprised you the most. Thank you for your attention and see you in the next one.